Russian forces made significant advances on the western bank of the Yanchur river line, gaining control over the fortifications in between Novomykolayivka in the north and Poltavka in the south, gaining full control over the road connecting the two settlements. In addition to this, continuous advances in the western direction, with the push from the south towards Novosibirsk and in the north towards Nove. The Russians put the Ukrainian fortifications in an operational encirclement. This led to the withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces, and an assault by the Russians on the northern and southern flanks of these fortifications allowed them to quickly gain control of them. In addition to this, further advances further westwards to the south of Novosibirsk, bypassing the fortifications in the western direction, south of them, and at the same time additional advances in the northern flank towards the town of Ivanopillia and Sqkm, where the Russians have now solidified their foothold in the eastern parts of the town and are advancing along the forest lines in the western direction, with an additional advance along the road and then in the secondary road from the main road towards Ivanopillia. This Russian push allows them to get closer and closer to the next settlements on the northern flank of these defensive lines. The Russians are quickly gaining control over the fortifications along the first line of defense. Following the capture of the road between Novomykolayivka and Poltavka, the Russians now have two main supply lines that connects the supplies from the logistical hubs to the frontline positions of the Russians. This allows them to significantly strengthen their offensive capabilities in the area. And with their foothold and full control over the Yanchur river line's eastern and western banks along the entire river line, the Russians now have a solid supply hub in Uspinivka itself following the capture of the settlement, which allows them to then develop offensive operations from these settlements. The difference between having a logistical hub and not having one is explained in simple terms, as there is an offensive group of Russian forces. Let's say they need 100 supplies. Just whatever it is, 100 supplies. What they would need is to receive those 100 supplies to the front line from the nearest logistical hub. Why from the nearest logistical hub? Because in the end, the supplies goes and comes from Russia itself to the Russian forces operating at the front line. Well, because the logistical hub can maybe carry 1,000 supplies. This means that the Russians can transport 1,000 supplies to the hub. From there, 100 supplies will go to the frontline positions every day. At the same time, it will be replenished by 100 every day. This means that 1,000 within the town will hold and be able to resupply the forces constantly. If they can hold 1,000, then they can supply 10 groups every day, and 1,000 can go to the logistical hub every day. And such is how the logistical hubs near the frontline works, is that the supplies go from one logistical hub to another every single day. So every single day, the travel of the supplies is not the 5,000 kilometers it needs from the production plants to the front line, but it is the few hundred meters or 10 kilometers, whatever it is, between the logistical hubs. This means every single day, Velika Novosilka supplies several locations, and that is why larger logistical hubs exist and is very important, because they can supply many areas that can then disperse into smaller groups. Then Velika Novosilka supplies, for example, Shevchenko and Priutne. Then these two supplies Okhnotnishne and Poltavka, Novoivanivka and Uspinivka. And as such, the supplies go around the entire area. Whatever the system is, we do not know. If we knew, the Ukrainians would be striking all of them exactly where they were, when they traveled, and so on. That's why information is extremely important. I'm setting Uspinivka as a logistical hub because it is a larger town. Whether it is Uspinivka or Novomykolayivka or Pavlivka or Privilne, some of these areas will have logistics and will act as a logistical hub for the forces operating in the direction of Sqkm, in the direction of Ivanopillia, Nove, and Novosibirsk. That is likely from Poltavka in the south, or even further south, Melinivka, which has been under Russian control for a long time. So it's more likely that that acts as a logistical hub. Could also be some of these settlements on the eastern bank of the Yanchur River. The further away it is, the more the travel time is for the frontline positions. The advances by the Russians along the first line of defense covers a significant distance across the Yanchur River towards the first settlements, capturing which the Russians will allow them to slowly push towards Ivanopillia, which will then allow them to attack the city itself from the northeastern direction, covering them from the eastern and northern flanks. So pressure continues along the defensive line and the settlements east of Ivanopillia. To the northeast of this, the Russians managed to gain control over the northern residential area of Pokrovsk, which was previously in the gray zone, and with that, the Russians now control 94% and the Ukrainians control 6% of the city. The 3.5% being the Dacha area in the north and 2.5% being the eastern Dacha area outside of the city itself. In the direction of Shakhove to the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to regain a foothold within the eastern parts of Shakhove, cutting off the road yet again. And with this, the Russians have cut off the roads yet again, leaving just a small dirt road in the northern flank of Shakhove connected to the fortifications north of the town to resupply the Ukrainian forces within the town of Shakhove and Volodymyrivka. The fighting taking place here within Shakhove is very intense as the Russians are flanking from the west and from the east, and the Ukrainians have been launching counterattacks consistently over the past few weeks, where they're looking to regain control over everything northwest of Shakhove, recapturing Ivanivka, Novoshachove, Vilne, and Kucherev Yar, as well as the quarries to the northwest. However, once they reach Shakhove, they met much resistance from the Russians and have been unable to advance further beyond that point, where the Russians are continuing their attempts to hold the siege over Shakhove. The Ukrainians then launch a counterattack to the east of Shakhove, where they managed to regain control over the eastern residential area, opening up the road in the eastern direction. But with this geolocated footage, it now confirms that the Russians have managed to regain their foothold within the eastern parts and are continuing clearing the buildings from Ukrainian soldiers and gaining full control over the eastern parts of Shakhove, which will then allow them to push into the town from the western and eastern directions in a pincer maneuver. Moving on to the Konstantinivka directions, the Russians managed to advance both within the city and to the south in the direction of Ivanopillia. The Russians have managed to gain full control over the choke point in the southern parts of Ivanopillia and northern parts of Klishivka, connecting the two towns by gaining control over the forest patch areas, the fortifications, and the roads leading up to the residential areas, and gaining full control over the first buildings here in the southern parts of the town. With this, the Russians have secured the southern parts of Ivanopillia and will continue advancing along the residential area up towards gaining full control over Ivanopillia, moving on to the eastern outskirts of Konstantinivka and connecting their forces between Ivanopillia in the south to the city in the north. The Russian push here along the western parts from the Dacha area has allowed them to gain some sort of fire control over the supplies going towards Ivanopillia from the north, limiting the supplies going to the Ukrainian forces and weakening the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians in the area, while also strengthening their own infiltration of the city itself. This allowed the Russians to strengthen their offensive operations in the direction of Ivanopillia and push through this defensive choke point the Ukrainians have been using to prevent a Russian push into the town. In combination with their forces attacking from the eastern flank following the capture of the fortifications, allowed them to combine the efforts from the south and from the east to then gain control over the area. And with this, the Russians will continue to push through Ivanopillia up towards the city. As for the eastern advance near the city itself, the Russians gain control over the fortifications on the eastern flank. About half of them is now under Russian control, leaving just a small portion between the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces to gain a foothold through the TO504 highway and into the city from the east. The Russians are here slowly pushing through the fortifications, gain full control over the eastern flank, expand their foothold and zone of control within the city itself, gain control over the TO504 highway in the north, and the Ivanopillia highway to the south. The Russians would be able to have several supply lines heading into the city from the south and the east to push through the residential area and the industrial area in the central parts of the city, and then slowly gain full control over it by infiltrating it from the south. The main fighting we see in these urban areas, as we've seen in the Pokrovsk and Venerat directions, is that the Russians gain a foothold, infiltrate with small numbers of forces, clearing building after building with support from FPV drones. Once they've gained a solid foothold within the city, they put in their FPV drone operators inside of it, from where the main clearing of buildings is done by these small groups of infantry and FPV drones in support of them, detecting the Ukrainian soldiers and striking them wherever they can. So this is the mass use of drones that we're seeing on the front line is now also being used offensively to capture cities in the same manner as defensive operations are pulled out. But the difference is you move inside the city, bring in the equipment, and now you're operating within the city itself, evening out the situation within the city and removing the defenders' advantage in urban warfare. Moving further north, the Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Vovchansk, where they managed to gain control over the central highway moving through from the northern to the southern parts of the town, and in the eastern direction as well. The Russians are here slowly moving through and clearing the buildings in the same manner as they're doing in Kościanivka, Pokrovsk and Menderat, where they have the infantry moving through and gaining a foothold within some of these more solid buildings, from where FPV drone operators are striking any Ukrainian positions they detect throughout the town, and the Russians are then clearing what remains of their forces after such strikes. The most difficult part for these FPV drone operators are apartment complex areas, which are very difficult for the drones to clear. These are areas where FAB bombs come in handy, and mainly infantry have to clear the buildings because of how they are built and how difficult it is to push through with drones. So it's not that the infantry are completely useless. They have to get these footholds. They have to clear perimeter so a Ukrainian counterattack doesn't clear out the Russian FPV drone operators, and they have to clear the more difficult positions such as industrial areas, especially underground facilities and apartment complex buildings. To the southwest of Sinelnikovo, the Russians continued advances along the forest patch area, where the initial push by the Russians across the Vovcha River line was through this forest patch area, and this shows that following the years of fighting within the forest patch areas, especially the Sqkm forest and the urban areas throughout the war, the Russians have been holding much more of these experiences, and this likely indicates that the Russians have taken much fewer casualties than the Ukrainians, because when you have to constantly reshuffle your manpower because of high losses, then the experience is lost. While if you do not take that many losses, the experience is retained and it can be taught to the next group, or if you return to combat, you will still have the experience you gained through the fighting. So this indicates the Russians have been taking fewer losses based on the fact that the Russians are advancing much quicker in forest areas and urban areas where the fighting has been taking place compared to the Ukrainians. And that is based on the consistency of these developments. We are seeing it now in the Vovchansk direction. We saw it following the quick capture of the Syrbianski forest area following years of fighting within it. We saw it in the Battle of Avdiivka, Pokrovsk and Menderat, now also Kościanivka. Practically everywhere the Russians are fighting within cities and within forest areas, they are advancing at a much faster pace compared to years ago, where they would struggle to advance even a bit. This likely means that the initial training by the Ukrainians was superior to the Russians, while now the Russians have completely outpaced the Ukrainians, creating both higher quality and higher quantity of forces. Or it could also just be the lack of manpower for the Ukrainians, and this is why such statements need to have some sort of research done prior to it for it to be reliable. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.